All right. Hello and welcome to our monthly class on the Epistle to the Hebrews, which we had talked about last month. Is difficult to define actually as an epistle, even though it was probably sent to a particular community, and it's not written to Hebrew people. So, what are we going to call it? Well, I don't know what else to call it. We're just going to call it the Epistle to the Hebrews, but that's kind of in air quotes. All right. And we're going to just work through chapter one. We're going to work through it pretty slowly. We're not going to get through all of chapter one today because this author has a very complex way of going through his arguments. And so you'll constantly see me throughout not just this presentation, but through the rest of our presentations on Hebrews, that I'm constantly going to be looking at, okay, where are we in the big picture? Where is this argument going? Where is it going to end? And I typically like to say, okay, if we know a passage is 10 verses long, then I can make sure that the way that I'm interpreting a particular verse in the middle of that makes sense with where the author has started and where the author is actually going. So uh, we'll constantly be zooming in and zooming out to make sure that we are on the right track. And I don't have all the answers. I might be mistaken. So be gracious to me if you feel like that you have some insight that I've overlooked. Um, I'm doing the best I can with what I have. So, but I have prepared as best I actually can. So, all right. Let me go and share my screen, and we will get started from the beginning. Okay. Um, I think I think we are at full screen. If I'm not at full screen, someone is going to jump in and yell at me. So,
We're
all
fine.
right. I'm sorry.
I was gonna say we're fine. You're fine.
We're
Go.
good. Good. Awesome. Okay. All right. So, the section that I wanted to give a title to is that God has spoken in a son. And you might think that seems pretty obvious. It seems fairly self evident. But I actually think that whenever an author of a biblical text is saying something over and over and over again, perhaps it's something that the original readers really needed to hear. Okay. So I don't think when we're reading through Hebrews that there were doctrinal issues that the community needed correction on. Okay. You don't see that, well, you believe this, but that's wrong, or that false teachers have come in and that they've changed things. We don't get that impression. What the impression that I get is that for a variety of reasons, whether it's persecution or social issues. People have stopped attending the regular meetings. They're in danger of falling away from the faith, from deserting Christ altogether. And the author tries to correct that by getting them to really pay attention to Jesus. Some of them are probably listening to Jesus, but they need to listen much more carefully. They need to give better attention to him. So if God has spoken in a son, then that means that we need to listen to what God is actually saying in and through Jesus. Okay. So uh, even though we're just going to be giving most of our attention to the opening four verses, there's a lot in these. I kind of want to see where the first four verses fit into the biggest section. And the biggest section, at least in which this is going to fit in, is actually all of chapter one and the first four verses of chapter two. Okay. So the details contained within Hebrews often make it difficult to see the big picture and the larger argument that is being presented. So we'll go through and we're going to see there's a lot of detail that we have to look at. There are a lot of verses that are difficult to understand, or they've got some words that could mean a couple of different things, and certain denominations have done different things with Hebrews than perhaps we're comfortable with, and so we have a lot we have to comment on. But I don't want to get so focused in on the weeds that we kind of forget where we are in the big picture. So let me give a brief outline of chapter 1, verse 1 through chapter 2, verse 4. So in the first four verses, we can see that God has definitively spoken through a highly exalted son. But it's not just that he's spoken through a son, he has done this in the last days. He's done it in these last days. And I think that's actually important. And I think that's probably one of the details that we tend to overlook. And then from verses 5 through 14, we can see that Jesus is greater than the angels. But the author portrays this not in a way to say that angels are bad or that the community is giving too much attention to the angels. I think the author is trying to say God has in the past spoken through angels. That's a good thing. God is now speaking through Jesus, the Son. A son is greater than angels. So if we were paying attention when God was speaking through angels, we should be paying all the more attention since God is now speaking through a son in these last days. So there's kind of a therefore in the first 4 verses of chapter 2. It is all the more urgent to pay attention to what Jesus is saying and doing in the present. Okay? So I'm being very careful here because some interpreters have said that God is now speaking through the Son, and that is contrasting with the angels because the angels are a bad thing, or the angels are part of the Old Testament, and the Old Testament's bad, or it's pointless, or it's no longer useful. He's not trying to say Jesus is good so that everything else is bad. I think he's saying that Jesus is better than all of these things, and that's all the more reason why we need to be listening and paying attention to him right now. Okay, so I want to kind of show you the first 4 verses of chapter 2. So again, we can see where our argument is going, and so that we can make sure that our interpretation is in line with where the author is actually trying to take his argument. All right, so this is chapter 2, verse 1. For this reason, we must pay much closer attention to what we have heard so that we do not drift away from it. Notice the warning there. We don't want to drift away. We don't want to fall away. We don't want to desert. Okay, why? For if the word spoken through angels proved unalterable, and every transgression and disobedience received a just penalty, how will we escape if we neglect so great a salvation after it was first spoken through the Lord? That's the Lord Jesus. It was confirmed to us by those who heard, God also testifying with them, both by signs and wonders and by various miracles and by gifts of the Holy Spirit according to his own will. So the way that I read that is that, look, if God spoke through angels, and that was a good thing, and the people that disobeyed when God spoke through angels, there was a just penalty. How are we going to escape if something is greater now spoken through the Lord Jesus? Okay. And then he recalls their own experience that, hey, after you listen to Jesus, some good things happened. Okay. There was the attesting signs and miracles and wonders through the Holy Spirit, and he's reminding them of their experience. Okay. So it's a call to pay attention to Jesus. They might have already started well, but in the Christian life, it's not how you start, it's how you end, and the author is encouraging them to continue to listen to Jesus, meaning to obey what he says so that they don't drift away from it. So I want to make sure that my interpretation of chapter 1 leads us to this conclusion here in chapter 2. And you'll notice there, he's not saying anything negative about angels. He's not saying anything negative about the Old Testament. He's just saying the Old Testament, it had its purpose. Now God is speaking through a son, and that's better. So if we didn't mess around when it came to the Old Testament teachings, we better not mess around now when something far more important is taking place. I think that's what's going on. So I'm trying to be very, very careful with reading this. Okay, so let's look at the first 2 verses. And I think what you'll notice here in the first 2 verses is that there is a contrast between the way that God has operated in the past and the way that God is operating right now. Okay. So God, after he spoke long ago to the fathers, that's to the ancestors, in the prophets, in many portions and in many ways, in these last days, has spoken to us in a son, whom he, that's God, whom God appointed heir of all things, through whom also he, that is God, made the world. Okay. So I thought it was best to kind of just make a chart to see what is actually being contrasted here. All right. So we have long ago, see this, I'm just using the language directly from it, and then what's actually happening in these last days. Okay. So you might think this is what God did long ago and this is what God is doing in the present. That is true, but he characterizes the present as in these last days. In these last days, okay? And I'm pointing that out because there are a lot of Christians who even have a really, really good belief in the kingdom of God. They think that the last days is still something in the future. Okay, but the New Testament is pretty clear that the last days really began with the ministry of Jesus and ultimately being clear with the day of Pentecost. The day of Pentecost indicates, with the scriptural quotation, that in these last days, God is going to pour out the Holy Spirit, and that is definitely what happened on the day of Pentecost. So anyway, so it's long ago compared to in the present, but the present is the last days. All right. So what happened long ago? God spoke long ago, but God is now speaking in these last days. And if it's in the last days, that means that they are eschatologically important. You know, with the overlap of the ages, with the age to come breaking into the present, okay, with the reign and the rule of God breaking into the present, and with the believers sharing and experiencing the reign and the rule of God right now, as they anticipate the full consummation in the future. I just got done writing chapters on all these things, so they're fresh in my mind. Um, the fact that God is now speaking in the last days that have broken into the present, that means that what's being said is really, really, really important. It's really important. Okay. All right. So in the past, God spoke to the ancestors. That is the fathers. The word for fathers, just another way of talking about ancestors. Um, and then now notice he's speaking to us. Okay. See, you could read the Bible and you could see, okay, well, God spoke to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And you might say, yeah, that is tangentially relevant to us. Okay. But if God spoke to you personally, that's a little bit more meaningful, you would say, right? Okay. So again, he's saying, yeah, God spoke in the past. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with God speaking to the ancestors. Whether and we'll see in the book of Hebrews who some of those ancestors are, whether it's Moses or Samuel or Joshua or in Hebrews chapter 11, all of these persons of faith. That whole argument is not that, oh, these things are bad or they're unimportant. They are important, but if God is speaking right now to you in the present, in the last days, that's all the more important. It's far more important. Okay. So in the past, God spoke through prophets. Again, those aren't bad. Nothing wrong with those prophets. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, the 12, those are important people. But now he's speaking through Jesus, and Jesus is the Son. And it's not just that he's just the Son, it's the Son whom God has exalted to be the heir of all things. Okay. So, I mean, prophets, they're important. Okay. They had, the word of Yahweh came to Isaiah, to Jeremiah. That's important. Okay. But speaking through a son is more important, especially if the son is the crucified and risen son who has now been highly exalted and God has given everything to the son. I mean, notice right there, it's not that he's going to appoint him as the heir of all things. God has already appointed Jesus as the heir of all things. One of the things that Hebrews is really getting me to appreciate is really how much God has highly exalted Jesus in the present. I know we look forward to the kingdom of God in which Jesus is going to, bring his rule and his reign to this earth, and that his reign is never going to end. But I don't think we think so much right now as to what Jesus is doing right now at the right hand of God. And from the perspective right now, that's been going on for 2,000 years. That's a big deal. Okay. So, and I don't think he's just sitting up twiddling his thumbs. And I don't think that he's just sitting up there uh, simply functioning as the high priest. Okay. There's something more that's going on. He's been the heir of all things. All right. But then notice here this last little part. This last little part is the part that I think is a little bit of trouble to Unitarians. Because it says also through whom, as in through Jesus, God made the world. Okay, so God's the creator. Jesus is not the creator. God is the creator, but God made it, at least according to this passage, through the Son. But that sounds like something that happened in the past. And you notice right there that would seem to break the continuity of this is what happened in the past, this is what's happening right now. Why would you say, look at right now, when the last days have been broken in the present, God's speaking to us. He's speaking to us through Jesus, through his son, whom God has made the heir of all things. That's happening right now, right now, right now. And then, oh, by the way, we're going to throw that God has created the world through Jesus in the past. You see how it kind of breaks the continuity of it? Okay. But there's some people that just say, well, yeah, the author did that, and so much the worse. I just don't think it works that way. Okay. Something has to be going on here, because this author, he is not going to let a mistake like that happen in the opening sentence. I don't think. So what do we do with this? What do we do with that? But you can see that just seems to be a little out of place. Okay. You would almost expect God working through Jesus to be in the second column, not in the first column. In other words, excuse me, it would be strange to say that God is now speaking through a son in these last days. Oh, but God was also speaking through a son in the earlier times. It just breaks the argument. It just doesn't make any sense. Okay. So what's actually taking place? Well, the author is presenting what I have called wisdom Christology. And I'm assuming that for some of the people that are going to be watching this, I know that there are a lot of people that are watching this live that have heard me talk about wisdom Christology a half dozen times. Okay. But there are going to be some people that are watching this for the first time and they have no idea what wisdom Christology is. So I just want to make sure that for the sake of the recording, that we clear the air and we understand what actually is taking place here, because not only have people never heard of what wisdom Christology is, if they are unfamiliar with it, then I think they're going to miss something that the author seems to already expect that his audience is already well aware of. And it was a Christological portrayal that was alive and well in the first century that I think a lot of people overlook. Okay, so in a detail that was familiar to those involved with the Pauline mission, the epistle to the Hebrews portrays the risen Jesus in terms of the embodiment of God's personified wisdom. So let me unpack that statement a little bit. Again, I don't think that Hebrews was written by Paul, but it was written to a community that was familiar with Paul's mission, because they are familiar with Timothy, and the author can talk about Timothy, and he can say, our brother Timothy has been recently released from prison. So Timothy was closely associated with the Pauline mission. So this community was familiar with that, which means they're probably familiar with Paul's teachings. They're familiar with Paul's theology. Okay. And this was probably written either very, very close to the time that Paul was martyred, or maybe a year or so after that. But all of Paul's writings would have already been in existence at this point. Paul was probably martyred, probably 64, 65, somewhere around there. Okay. All right. So first, let's just kind of show where in the world would the New Testament authors get the idea that Jesus is the embodiment of wisdom. Well, Jesus described himself in terms of wisdom, and I'm not going through all the passages. I have a chapter in my forthcoming systematic theology book, to be released in August, by the way. It is on pace for that, where I go through all the details, because I think people need to know this. But let me just kind of give you a brief overview of it. So Jesus spoke of himself as God's wisdom. He said in Matthew 11, the Son of Man came eating and drinking, and they say, behold, a gluttonous man and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. And then Jesus describes himself, but he describes himself as wisdom, and not just as ordinary, basic, mundane wisdom, but as God's wisdom personified as a female figure. Wisdom is vindicated not by its deeds, but when wisdom is vindicated by her deeds. But what he means is that Jesus is going to be vindicated by his deeds. Because actually earlier in the passage in Matthew chapter 11, verse 2, John the Baptist was asking about the deeds of Jesus, and Jesus answers by talking about the deeds of wisdom, because he's referring to himself. He believes himself as the embodiment of God's wisdom. Okay? The authors of the gospel accounts, definitely Matthew, Luke, and John, maybe Mark, but definitely Matthew, Luke, and John, they also believed and they portrayed Jesus as the embodiment of God's wisdom. And then Paul taught it pretty clearly to his churches that Jesus was the embodiment of God's wisdom. Here's a pretty easy, straightforward passage, 1 Corinthians 1:24. But to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ is the power of God and the wisdom of God. Boom, right there. He explicitly says Jesus is the wisdom of God, or the wisdom from God. He says that right in the opening chapter, which means that that's kind of a foundational thing that Paul is saying in First Corinthians. And he'll say it again in verse 30, but he expects that theology and that Christological understanding to be understood as he unpacks his argument in First Corinthians. Okay. My point is that prior to the writing of Hebrews, Jesus taught this in his ministry. We know that the writers of the gospel accounts, which are probably writing after Hebrews, to be fair, but they are aware and they're alive of this tendency, and they're going to portray Jesus as the embodiment of God's wisdom. And Paul taught this too. He taught it in First Corinthians. He taught it in Second Corinthians. There's echoes of it in Romans. It's definitely there in Colossians. There's places to where it's also there in Galatians as well. So the Pauline mission would be aware of it. Very likely the recipients of Hebrews would also be aware of it. Okay? So I think we can reasonably suggest that the original audience was therefore familiar with the complex Christological concept, even if it is overlooked by most modern readers. Okay? So again, to say that Jesus is the embodiment of God's wisdom is to take this personified figure of God's wisdom that we see primarily in the Old Testament, and it's there basically in Psalms, like in one place in Psalms, it's Psalm 104. It's there in Job, particularly in Job 28, but definitely in Proverbs. Proverbs 1, Proverbs 2, Proverbs 3, Proverbs 8, and Proverbs 9, and then ultimately culminating in women who are the embodiment of God's wisdom in Proverbs 31. Okay? So the New Testament authors would think that Jesus is the climactic embodiment of God's wisdom, that is, God's wise interaction and instruction to his creation. Okay. So getting back to this phrase here, what does it mean through whom also he made the world? Through whom, as in through Jesus, God made the world. What's going on here? Well, what we have here is actually a saying that is attributing to Jesus something that had already been said about God's wisdom. So I'll give you a clear passage from the Psalms. I talked about Psalm 104. Notice who the subject is and how God is instrumentally using his wisdom. Okay, so the psalmist is praising Yahweh. He says, "Oh Yahweh, how many are your works? In wisdom, you have made them all. The earth is full of your possessions." Okay, so here we can see that Yahweh is praised because of his works. He is the one that made all of them, but God made them in his wisdom, or with his wisdom. And then, therefore, the earth is full of all of his possessions. Okay? So it indicates that God used his wisdom to create everything. Now, what does it mean for God to use his wisdom in a poetic passage like this? It means that God wisely ordered things. Okay? God put he infused creation with his goodness, with his purpose, with his wise ordering. He didn't create things chaotic. They're not falling apart. They're not broken. He's wisely ordering his creation. So the poets in the Old Testament would portray that by saying God made things with his wisdom, or God made things through his wisdom. So the wisdom is kind of the instrument, and it's just God's wisdom. It's one of his attributes. Sometimes that wisdom gets personified as a female figure, but it's not an actual female person alongside Yahweh. It's just personification of God's wise attributes. But notice here, wisdom's not the creator. You know, the works are Yahweh's. Yahweh is the one who made them all. He's the subject of the verb to make, and then the possessions belong to him. Okay. However, in Hebrews, in verses 2 and 3, there are 4 different things that are said about Christ that are drawing on things that were formerly said about God's wisdom. And the main reason, this is, make sure that we're all paying attention here. This is really important, okay? It's a little complex. The main reason why people don't know this, and this gets overlooked, is that the author of Hebrews is being inspired by not an Old Testament passage, not a New Testament passage, but by one of our intertestamental books, okay? This doesn't mean that the author thinks that this intertestamental book is part of Scripture or that it's inspired. It's just the author of Hebrews is going to be doing all of his citations from the Greek version of the Old Testament. The Greek version of the Old Testament, which we call the Septuagint, included all of these intertestamental books. Okay, the Greek version did. The Hebrew version did not. Okay, and so this particular intertestamental book is Wisdom of Solomon. So what I need to show you here are the four places where Jesus in Hebrews chapter 1 is described as doing things that wisdom formerly did, because the author thinks that Jesus is the embodiment of wisdom, but the author uses the language and the argument drawing from this one intertestamental book, which I'm just going to assume that most people have, maybe they heard of, but they probably haven't read through it. Okay, that's why this is a little bit complex. But I mean, this is what the author's doing. Okay, we can like it or we can dislike it, but this is what he's doing, so we got to take it seriously. So in Wisdom of Solomon, this is an intertestamental book, not really written by Solomon, but it's talking about Solomon's wisdom. It's probably written roughly 100 years before the book of Hebrews was written. The author is praying here, and he says, "O God of my ancestors and Lord of mercy, who have made all things by your word and by your wisdom, you have formed humankind." So here we can see that the God of the ancestors created all things through his word and through his wisdom. Notice that word and wisdom are just different ways of saying how God created all things. Okay, so God made all things through his word and his wisdom. Hebrews says God has made all things through the Son. Okay, because the Son is the embodiment of God's wisdom. In Hebrews chapter 1, verse 3, and we'll come back and look at this verse in a little bit more detail, it says that he, Jesus, is the radiance, or it could be translated as reflection of his glory, and the his is God's glory. Jesus is the reflection of God's glory. Okay? Then it uses a very, very, very rare Greek word here, apavgasma. Okay? Next time you're on Jeopardy, you'll get that question right. Okay? It's very, very rare. Okay? So rare that the other place where it shows up is a passage that describes, guess what? God's wisdom. And that's also is in Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 7, verse 26, where it talks about she, the personification of God's wisdom. Wisdom is the same word there, the reflection of eternal light, a spotless mirror of the working of God, and an image of his goodness. And you can see how that makes sense, okay? God's wisdom is just going to reflect God's brightness, the good working of God, and God's own goodness, okay? And so the writer of Hebrews thinks that because Jesus is the embodiment of wisdom, the things that are said about God's wisdom can now be said about Jesus. Jesus is the reflection of God's glory, but clearly drawing on this wisdom passage. Later in verse 3, Hebrews says that he, Jesus, upholds all things by the word of his power. And I'm going to be gracious here. I'm going to assume that the word of his power is actually Jesus' power, but I do think it's the power that God has given to Jesus. Jesus possesses nothing that God did not already give him. Okay, but this is something Jesus is doing right now. I mean, he upholds all things. And I don't think people think about this too often. Jesus right now, not in the past, right now, in his highly exalted position, is upholding all things with his powerful word. But, what else upholds all things? Well, in Wisdom of Solomon chapter 1, it talks about how wisdom is a kindly spirit that has filled the world and that which holds all things. So wisdom holds all things. And guess what? The resurrected Jesus upholds all things. And then Jesus, after he made purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high. Okay, clearly the Majesty on high is Yahweh, just another way of talking about God. But in Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 9, verse 4, the author prays to God, and he says, "Give me the wisdom that sits by your throne." Okay? So we've got four highly exalted things that are said about not Jesus in his earthly ministry, but Jesus as the crucified, risen, and highly exalted one. Okay? God has made all things through the Son. Okay? The Son is the reflection of God's glory. The Son is currently upholding all things with his powerful word, and the Son has now taken his seat at the right hand of the Majesty on high. All of these things were said about God's wisdom in this book, Wisdom of Solomon. This is why scholars have really, at this point, reached a consensus that the writer of Hebrews is deliberately drawing upon this sort of language as its pool of images to describe Christ. But if you're a Protestant and you don't have wisdom of Solomon in your Bible, you're not going to know any of these things. Okay. Um, and again, I'm not suggesting that you need to add wisdom of Solomon to your canon. I'm not saying that at all. I'm just saying that the author is clearly drawing from this book in his portrayal of Jesus, but he's doing it because Jesus talked about himself in terms of God's wisdom. And the early Christians talked about Jesus in terms of God's wisdom. And Paul taught that Jesus is the wisdom of God. And so they would take these things that are said about God's wisdom and they would apply them to Jesus. Not that Jesus was the wisdom in the Old Testament, but that if you're looking for God's wisdom, you're now going to find it embodied in Jesus. Okay. So again, I don't want to get too focused on the details that we forget where we are in the argument. All right. So just recap. God has spoken through prophetic spokesmen in the past. Guess what? That's a good thing. Okay. God is now speaking to us. So we better give our attention to his message. God is even speaking through a better agent, his own son. And by the way, a father's own son was the most qualified agent that he could send, certainly better than human prophets, even though there's nothing wrong with human prophets. Okay. Furthermore, this son has been highly exalted by God to be the heir of all things. And you can't blow off what someone with that prestige has to say to us. Okay. I mean, if Jesus is the number 2 person in the universe and God is speaking through Jesus to you, you can't ignore that. You can't, send that call to voicemail. I mean, you gotta pay attention. All right. So just to be clear here, nothing has been said thus far that speaks badly about the Old Testament to suggest that the prophets were inadequate or otherwise unimportant. Speaking through the highly exalted Son is simply a better agent. If the prophets were important, then speaking to Jesus is extremely important. Okay, hopefully that's pretty clear for us to see at this point. Okay, so that's the first 2 verses. Sorry that took a long time, but Hebrews is complex. Okay, let's move to verse 3. And not just verse 3, but the highly exalted status of Jesus. Okay. So verse 3 and verse 4 are going to focus on who Jesus is right now. Like after, it's not just after his resurrection, because after Jesus' resurrection, God gave him all authority in heaven and on earth. Matthew 28:18. Philippians 2:9 says that God highly exalted Jesus, gave him the name that's above every name. So he's the resurrected and highly exalted Jesus. Okay, so let's look at the language that's used here in chapter 1, verse 3. Jesus is the radiance or the reflection of God's glory. What does this mean? What does this mean? Okay, so as the embodiment of God's wisdom, Jesus naturally is going to reflect God's glory to others. Okay, in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, Paul will just flat out say Jesus is the glory of God. But again, he's drawing on this wisdom language, as we've already seen, to where wisdom is the reflection of God's glory, the image of God's goodness. If we want to see that reflection, Jesus fully reflects to us what God is like in his character and in his faithfulness. That's a big deal. I mean, you look at Jesus. I mean, we talk about a lot how like, oh, we're supposed to be Christ to the world. And when people listen and hear us, that they're supposed to be listening and seeing Christ. We view ourselves as kind of imaging or reflecting Jesus to the world. Well, take that same idea and just look at Jesus was imaging or reflecting God to the world as perfectly as he possibly could. It's a big deal. Okay. And then the NASB will say that Jesus is the exact representation of God's nature. Well, what does he mean by nature? A lot of people that, of course, are already indebted to the Nicene Creed or the Chalcedonian Creed are going to take that definition of nature and they're going to read it back into Hebrews. The problem, though, is that nobody in the first century used this word for nature to mean what people meant 400 years later. So that's an anachronistic reading of nature. So if it doesn't mean that, what does it actually mean? Okay. So because the word for nature is hypostasis. Okay. But the exact representation is this word character, and it actually is just an imprint. It's a stamp. Okay. But if I got this pen right here, okay, and I got this piece of paper, and I kind of do this, and I make a dot on there, okay, this dot owes its existence to the pen. The pen was here first, and the pen made the imprint on it. Okay. So to say that Jesus is the imprint or the stamp of God's nature doesn't make them co equal. In fact, it means the opposite. It means that God was there first and God made his imprint. He made an impactful impression on Jesus in a way that reflects his, whatever his nature means. Okay. The hypostasis, hypo just is actually a preposition that means under. The word for above would be hyper. So hypo means below. And then stasis has to do with standing. But if you're like standing under something, the visual image there is that you are stabilizing something, okay? You're holding it steady. You are kind of a foundational thing, all right? And this language would be used to describe uh, God's faithfulness, his steadfastness, the assurance of God. You can kind of understand how that language could be understood as steadfastness, holding fast, like he's holding it, holding the foundation, kind of like the the like the foundational pillars. But we don't have to guess on this because this word hypostasis occurs two other times in Hebrews, and guess what? It doesn't mean God's nature in the sense of Nicaea and Chalcedon. It means God's steadfast assurance and confidence, as you can see. So you can just look at the other places. We're just doing a word study here. So in Hebrews chapter 3, verse 14, easy to see. For we have become partakers of Christ if only we hold our first confidence, that's that word hypostasis, firm to the end. Okay. Confidence is kind of that steadfast assurance. Again, you got to hold on to it. Okay. But it doesn't mean the nature of God in the, in the sense of like, co-equal natures. That's not what it means. It means kind of this firm steadfastness. And that's the key thing, is that that's what Jesus says. Jesus is the stamp and the imprint of God's steadfast confidence. When we look at Jesus, he bears the faithfulness that fully reflects God's own faithfulness. The other passage, of course, is in chapter 11, verse 1. Now, faith is the assurance of the things hoped for, and then the author goes and clarifies what he means. It's the conviction of the things not seen. So clearly, assurance there doesn't mean hypostasis in the Chalcedonian sense. It means a steadfast assurance, okay? And those are all the occurrences in Hebrews. So we can see how the author of Hebrews uses it in the non-controversial places. Just start with the things that are easy, and then from there you can work through the things that are ambiguous or controversial, and you can make some pretty good educated guesses, okay? So God has impressed upon Jesus his own character of steadfastness and faithfulness. What does that mean? What does it mean that Jesus is the exact representation of God's steadfastness and faithfulness? It means that we can trust in Jesus to the same degree that we can trust in God. That's a big deal. All right. All right. Hebrews chapter 1, verse 3 goes on. And Jesus, upholds all things with the word of his power. That's a big deal. That's a big deal. And I don't think that Unitarians give enough weight to this. I mean, look at what Jesus is doing right now. I mean, look at the level of empowerment that God has given to Jesus. Okay? Again, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to Jesus. Therefore, Jesus upholds all things right now with his own powerful word. So as the highly exalted Son, to whom God has made the heir of all things, Jesus possesses the God-given capacity to rule God's creation. Okay? So again, you can't say that Jesus is upholding all things right now, and yet he's not ruling or reigning in some sense. Okay, like he's sitting at the right hand of God. And as I constantly tell people, he's not sitting on a hammock and he's not sitting on a folding chair. If he's sitting somewhere, he's enthroned. If he's enthroned, he's functioning as a king, at least in some capacity. Well, what is he doing? Well, Hebrews tells us he's upholding all things with the word of his power. That's a big deal. Okay. Now, this is not something that was happening in the past. It's something he's doing right now. He's doing this right now. So it's something that I think, if you're a Unitarian, you gotta fit this into your definition of how much God has empowered Jesus. And to me, I don't think it doesn't make me feel uneasy about Jesus. If anything, it makes me respect God more. Look at what God can do to a human being. All right, Hebrews chapter 1, verse 3 continues. All right, when he made the purification of sins, when Jesus had made the purification of sins, okay, well, obviously this refers to Jesus' atoning death. And of course, if Jesus died, it proves that he was mortal. If he was mortal, clearly he is not God, or he's not divine. That much is self evident. So after he made the purification of sins, he sat down at the right hand of the majesty on high. Why did they describe God as the majesty on high? Well, sometimes the writers of the Bible, they don't want to say God or they don't want to say his name. So they'll use a different word, a circumlocution. So they'll say the majesty on high. They kind of, out of respect and reverence for God. They never do that for Jesus, by the way. They have no problem saying Jesus or saying the Son or saying they saw the Son or giving a description of the Son. But they have this reverence and awe and respect for God. They don't have that same understanding for Jesus because Jesus is not God. That much is clear. Okay? You're sitting at the right hand of somebody. That's a highly exalted position, but you're not co-equal to that person. You're that person's right-hand man. And I do mean man. So God exalted Jesus to heaven. God gave to Jesus a throne alongside him and thereby empowered him to rule from that throne. Well, what does that rule encompass? Well, at least partially, it encompasses upholding all things with this powerful word. Okay. Psalm 110 here is quoted. Technically, it should be alluded or echoed. Sat down at the right hand. Probably more of an allusion. It'll be definitely quoted in chapter 1, verse 13 a little bit later. But here it's more of an allusion or an echo. But Psalm 110 is going to appear several times in Hebrews. Actually, Psalm 110 is quoted or alluded in Hebrews more than any other New Testament book. Some people even suggested that the book of Hebrews is actually a sermon on Psalm 110. That argument's been suggested. That's probably a little bit of a stretch, but not by much. When we see how frequently it shows up in Hebrews, you're going to say, wow, it's a pretty big deal. Okay. But in the allusion of Psalm 110, I want us to see what the passage says and how the author of Hebrews has actually identified its subjects. So Psalm 110, verse 1, Yahweh says to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. Okay. So this is, of course, Yahweh summoning a second figure to God's right hand, which means an exaltation to heaven. Okay. To sit enthroned at God's right hand until there is a defeat of the enemies. Okay, so there's a level of ruling until the enemies are ultimately all under his feet. Okay, but how does Hebrews interpret this? It's the majesty on high said to the crucified and risen Son, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. Okay, so is Jesus the majesty on high? Answer, no, he's not. He's the one that's sitting at the right hand of the majesty on high. He's the one that died, and the majesty on high is the one who raised this crucified Son, this crucified mortal Jesus, gave him immortality. Okay. Again, I know for a lot of you, I'm just preaching to the choir. It's self-evident to you, but it's not self-evident to a lot of people. They haven't taken the time to look at the distinctions that are here. So Jesus is highly exalted, no doubt, but he's not the true God. The two are distinguished, and everything Jesus possesses is due to God giving it to him. That much is clear. All right. Verse 4. Having become as much better than the angels as he has inherited a more excellent name than they. Let's just kind of break this down. So, if Jesus became greater than the angels, then it is self-evident that he formerly was lower than the angels. Now, when was he lower than the angels? Okay. I actually think that the author of Hebrews gives a hint of what he means by this later in chapter 2, verse 9. And I think that he believes that Jesus was lower than the angels at the point when he was dead. So look at this passage and tell me what you think, okay? But we do see him who was made for a little while lower than the angels, namely Jesus, because of the suffering of death, crowned with glory and honor, okay? So he was just made just for a little while, just for a short time, lower than the angels, okay? Now, some people think that's just in reference to his ministry. That's possible. But I think obviously, while he's dead, he's lower than the angels who are alive. Okay, I think that makes sense here. And so he because he mentions here that He was formerly lower. Now he's been exalted, and he explains it because of the suffering of death. Now he's crowned with glory and honor. So I think the being made lower for a little time refers to his death while he was dead. So that's my guess. That's my best reading of the passage. Okay. So what did he do? Jesus has inherited as an heir a name, but he's already inherited this in the present. He's not going to inherit these things. He has inherited a more excellent name than they, as in a more excellent name than the angels. Of course, this demonstrates that he is superior to the angels. But again, this isn't saying anything bad about the angels. There's nothing wrong with them. The author's not saying angels are bad, Jesus is good. He's saying Jesus is great and better than the angels. And the angels were, of course, some of these messengers through whom God spoke in the past. So, what is this name that Jesus inherited? I'm actually not sure, but I'm going to give you three options. I'm going to give you three possibilities that I think scholars have come up with, and you can kind of decide what you actually think that it is, okay? Or maybe it's an option I don't even have up here, okay? Is this name God's own name? Is God sharing his name with Jesus in the sense of an agent bearing the name of a sender? We know from the Jewish principle of agency that whenever a sender sends the agent bears the name of the sender in his capacity as the agent of the sender. And Philippians 2, 9 through 10 explicitly states that God has given to Jesus the name that's above all names. Well, what is the name above all names? So that's God's name. Okay, which is why the most exalted things that are said about Jesus are after his resurrection. I think it's because as the agent of God, he fully represents God to the point where he can even bear God's name. So he can be called the Alpha and the Omega, the first and last in Revelation, that sort of stuff. Not identifying him with that, but he's bearing those titles as God's agent. Another option is that the name could be Lord, that title from Psalm 110. We know that, of course, Jesus was exalted to that position of lordship. So that's possible, and it's immediately in the context. So I think there's a good case that can be made for that. Or it could actually be son in the sense of that he has inherited the exalted messianic status as the Son of God and as the King. And the reason why that option has been presented is because verse 4 is going to move to verse 5, and he's going to contrast specifically the angels and the Son. And so, people have said, well, okay, that at least fits in the context there. Okay. I'm not saying that if you pick one of these, that it doesn't mean the other ones, because all of them in some sense are true. I think some people don't like the suggestion that Jesus has inherited the name of the Son or the title of the Son, because it might suggest that he wasn't the Son before. Well, clearly he was the Son before. But even Romans chapter 1, verse 4 says that the resurrection, Jesus was exalted to Son of God with power, even though he was God's Son at his birth. And Romans 1:3 says that. So he could be Son of God at a different level of empowerment at his exaltation. So I don't know what the answer to that is. The author doesn't tell us. And when the author doesn't tell me something, all I can do is guess. But here are some good options. Okay. All right, takeaways, three applications. I know we only went through 4 verses, but there's a lot in there. There's a lot of detail in there, okay? And I don't want to miss that stuff, but I do think we can walk away with some takeaways and some applications. Number 1, God has spoken through the most qualified agent in existence. We had better listen to what he says. Big takeaway. Big takeaway. That's one of the ways that Hebrews is extremely applicable, no matter when you're reading it. Number 2, the ministry of Jesus and his resurrection have demonstrated that the last days have broken into the present. Why does this matter? The climactic time to action, obedience, and hope of Christ's return is right now, not in some distant time in the future. I say that because there are some people that think, well, are we in the last days? Are we not in the last days? Maybe we're in the last days. Well, maybe if I see a temple rebuilt, I'll know we're in the last days. Or if I think there's an antichrist, we're going to be in the last days. You're missing the point. And I think the suggestion there is that, well, whenever I know I'm in the last days, that's when I'm going to start to be serious as a Christian. That's the wrong way to read the New Testament. The point is, whenever you think the last days is, we need to be serious as a Christian right now. Right now. Don't wait for any sort of signs in the future. Jesus says, be on the alert, be ready, be waiting, you know, blessed is the person whom the master finds so doing, you know, not waiting for something to happen. We need to be faithful and obedient right now. The last days is right now, which means that the time for action and obedience and looking forward to the return of Jesus, that's something we need to be doing right now. Don't wait for the future. Get to being obedient right now. And lastly, if God has empowered the human Messiah to bear all things with this powerful word, imagine what God can do to faithful human beings when he installs them as rulers over his creation at Christ's return. If God is already doing this through Jesus, imagine what God is going to do with a bunch of human beings as his faithful stewards in the kingdom when Christ returns. When God again has human beings just like he had in Genesis 1 and 2 with God working through Adam and Eve to rule over a garden. Okay. If God is already doing this through Jesus, what can God do through us? I just think by looking at Jesus, we're like, wow, look at the potential for human beings and how God can use us. And I think that gives us motivation and confidence and self value and worth and purpose and all sorts of things. So anyway, those are my applications. Thank you for watching. I will see you next time, and appreciate you sticking around this long. I'll stop my recording right now.